The desert pottery lady finally showed up. Hope she doesn't smell like clay. Margaret Hayes would never forget that moment. She stood at the entrance of the engagement party venue, halfway through removing her coat, when Olivia's voice reached her ears. Low, but distinct. A whisper meant for friends. Yet it struck Margaret like thunder. Her 67-year-old body froze. The handbag in her grip nearly slipped from her sweating palm. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Heat flooded her cheeks. The venue glowed under cascading chandeliers. Crystal glasses clinked on marble tables. Women in designer dresses glided past with practiced elegance. Men in tailored suits exchanged firm handshakes and polite laughter. Everything sparkled. Everything shimmered. And Margaret felt utterly out of place. She wore a simple navy dress, clean, pressed, modest. She had chosen it carefully that morning, standing before her bedroom mirror in the small adobe house she had called home for 30 years. The dress had seemed appropriate then. Now it felt like a costume from another era. Olivia stood 15 feet away, surrounded by 3 women in silk and satin. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves over bare shoulders. Diamond earrings caught the light. Her laugh was musical, controlled. She did not look in Margaret's direction, but Margaret knew the comment had been deliberate, calculated. The humiliation sank deep. Margaret had raised 2 children alone after her husband died young. She had built a pottery studio from nothing, shaping clay with her own hands, firing kilns in the desert heat, selling pieces to tourists and locals alike. She had worked every single day for decades. Her hands bore the scars of labor. Her back ached in the mornings. But she had never felt shame about her life. Until now. She considered leaving. The door stood just behind her. She could slip out quietly, drive back to her studio, pretend she had felt unwell. No one would miss her. No one except Ryan. Her son appeared at her side before she could move. 38 years old, tall and steady, with kind eyes that reminded her of his father. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Mom," he said softly, "come with me for a second." He guided her through a side door into a quieter hallway. The noise of the party faded behind them. Margaret blinked back tears. She refused to cry. Not here, not now. Ryan faced her, his expression unreadable. She expected embarrassment. She expected him to ask her to leave early, to spare him further discomfort. Instead, his jaw tightened. His eyes held something she had not seen before: determination, resolve. "Mom, just trust me," he said. His voice was low but firm. "Tomorrow, everything will make sense." The words made no sense. Tomorrow was the wedding. What could possibly make sense then? "Ryan, I heard what she said. I know." He cut her off gently. "I know exactly what she said. And I know a lot more than that." His tone sent a chill through her. This was not the voice of a man preparing for his wedding day. This was the voice of someone preparing for battle. "What do you mean?" Margaret whispered. Ryan glanced back toward the party. Music drifted through the walls. Laughter echoed. He looked back at his mother, and for a brief moment she saw pain flicker across his face. Then it vanished, replaced by that same hard resolve. "I can't explain right now," he said, "but I need you to stay. I need you to be there tomorrow. Can you do that for me?" Margaret searched his eyes. She saw no doubt there, no hesitation. Whatever he was planning, he had thought it through. She did not understand, but she trusted him. She had always trusted him. "Okay," she said quietly. Ryan pulled her into a brief hug. When he released her, his expression softened slightly. "Let's go back in, just for a little while. Then you can go home and rest." They returned to the party together. Margaret kept her head high, though her stomach churned. Olivia was now at the center of the room, surrounded by admirers. She glanced at Margaret once, a flicker of disdain crossing her perfect features before she turned away. Margaret stayed for another hour. She sipped sparkling water. She nodded politely when introduced to distant relatives and family friends. She smiled when required. But inside, her mind raced. Ryan's words echoed endlessly. Tomorrow, everything will make sense. What did he know? What had he discovered? And why did his eyes look so cold when he glanced at his fiancée? The evening finally ended. Margaret drove home through the dark desert roads, her headlights cutting through the vast emptiness. The stars overhead were brilliant, unobstructed by city lights. She had always found comfort in that vastness. Tonight, it felt heavy. Her studio came into view. A low adobe structure with a hand-painted sign that read Desert Bloom Studio. The kiln sat silent in the yard. Shelves of pottery lined the workshop. This place was her life. Every bowl, every vase, every piece carried her fingerprints, her breath, her soul. She parked and sat in the car for a long moment. The insult still stung. The desert pottery lady, as if her work meant nothing, as if her life meant nothing. But Ryan's words lingered louder. Tomorrow. Margaret climbed out of the car and walked to the studio door. She unlocked it and stepped inside. The familiar smell of clay and glaze surrounded her. She ran her hand along a workbench, feeling the smooth wood worn by years of use. Something was coming. She did not know what, but she could feel it the way she could feel storms gathering over the desert. The air changed before rain fell. The sky shifted. The wind carried warnings. Tomorrow, her son had said. Margaret turned off the lights and locked the door. She walked to her small house and climbed into bed, but sleep did not come easily. Her mind replayed the evening over and over. Olivia's cruel whisper, Ryan's strange calmness, the weight of secrets she could not yet name. Outside, the desert night stretched on in silence, and Margaret lay awake, waiting for the storm she knew was coming. The clay had always spoken to her in ways words never could. Margaret woke before dawn, as she had done for 30 years. The insomnia from the previous night left her groggy, but her hands moved automatically through the morning routine. Coffee. Toast. The familiar walk across the yard to her studio. Desert Bloom Studio stood quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. She unlocked the door and flipped the light switch. Fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, illuminating rows of pottery in various stages of completion. Bowls waited for glazing. Vases sat ready for the kiln. A half-finished tea set occupied her main workbench. She settled onto her stool and pulled a lump of clay toward her. Her fingers sank into the cool, damp earth. She began kneading, working out air bubbles, preparing the clay for the wheel. The motion calmed her racing thoughts. This studio was more than a workplace. It was a testament to survival. Margaret had been 37 when James died. A heart attack, sudden and merciless. One moment he was laughing at the dinner table, the next he was gone. Ryan had been 8. Emily had been 6. Too young to lose their father. Too young to understand why their mother cried every night for months. The insurance money had been modest. James had worked as an elementary school teacher. They had never been wealthy. Margaret found herself alone with 2 children, a mortgage, and terror that felt like drowning. She had learned pottery in college, a minor alongside her education degree. After James died, she returned to it out of desperation. She needed something to quiet her mind, something to occupy her hands while grief consumed her heart. She began small, a few bowls sold at a local craft fair, then some vases commissioned by a bed and breakfast owner. Word spread slowly through the small New Mexico community. Her work gained a reputation for honesty. Nothing fancy, nothing pretentious, just solid, functional pottery made with care. Within 5 years, she had built Desert Bloom Studio. She converted an old storage shed on her property into a proper workshop. She installed a kiln. She added shelves. She painted the sign herself, choosing desert, marigold, yellow for the letters. The studio became her lifeline. On days when she could barely afford groceries, she would lose herself in the clay. When Ryan came home with a black eye from school bullies, she taught him to shape bowls as a way to channel anger. When Emily cried over her first heartbreak, they glazed pottery together in silence. Her children grew up covered in clay dust. They learned patience at the wheel. They learned that beauty required work, that art demanded discipline, that nothing worth having came easily. Margaret never remarried. Men had shown interest over the years, but she had no energy left for romance. Her children needed her. Her studio needed her. That was enough. Ryan and Emily both left for college. Ryan studied environmental science, driven by a passion for desert conservation. Emily pursued social work, determined to help families in crisis. Margaret was proud. She had raised them alone, and they had grown into good people. The studio sustained her through their absence. She expanded the business slowly, adding a small Airbnb cottage on the property. Tourists came to experience the desert. They stayed in her cottage, bought her pottery, left positive reviews online. The income was modest, but steady. She had built a life, not glamorous, but honest, not wealthy, but sufficient. She owned her land outright. She owed nothing to anyone. At 67, she could look back with satisfaction. Until Olivia Carter entered the picture. Margaret had met her 6 months ago. Ryan had called, voice bright with excitement. "Mom, I met someone. Her name is Olivia. I think you're going to love her." Margaret had felt immediate joy. Her son deserved happiness. He had spent his adult life working for a regional environmental organization, fighting to protect desert ecosystems from commercial development. The work was meaningful, but exhausting. He rarely dated seriously. This felt significant. The first meeting took place at an upscale restaurant in the city, an hour's drive from Margaret's studio. She had arrived early, nervous and eager. She wore her best dress, applied makeup carefully, brought a small pottery piece as a gift. Olivia arrived 20 minutes late. She swept in wearing a white pantsuit that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly income. Her blonde hair gleamed. Her smile was dazzling. She apologized for her tardiness with a laugh that sounded rehearsed. Margaret had tried. She asked questions about Olivia's work in her family's real estate development firm. She complimented Olivia's jewelry. She smiled until her cheeks ached. But something felt wrong. Olivia's eyes never quite focused on Margaret when they spoke. Her answers were polite but distant. She checked her phone repeatedly. When Margaret mentioned her pottery studio, Olivia had nodded vaguely and changed the subject. Ryan seemed oblivious. He held Olivia's hand. He laughed at her jokes. He looked at her with complete adoration. Margaret saw her son happy and tried to ignore her unease. The relationship progressed quickly. Within 3 months, Ryan proposed. Margaret had expected a longer courtship, but Ryan insisted Olivia was the one. The wedding was scheduled with startling speed, 6 months from proposal to ceremony. Margaret met Olivia's parents at their home, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. Charles and Vivian Carter radiated wealth and confidence. Their house featured marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that probably cost more than Margaret's entire property. The dinner had been uncomfortable. Charles asked pointed questions about Margaret's land. How many acres did she own? What was the property value? Had she considered selling? Margaret had deflected politely, confused by the interrogation. Vivian had smiled throughout, but her eyes remained cold. She asked about Margaret's income from the Airbnb, about her retirement plans, about whether she had a will. The questions felt invasive, but Margaret told herself they were just being thorough. They wanted to know about their future son-in-law's family. That was natural, wasn't it? Ryan had seemed tense during that dinner. He barely ate. He kept glancing at his mother, his expression worried. When Margaret asked him about it later, he brushed off her concerns. "They're just protective of Olivia. Don't worry about it, Mom." But Margaret did worry. Something about the Carters felt predatory. The way Charles looked at her reminded her of developers who occasionally approached her about buying her land. Men who saw property, not people. Men who calculated value in dollars, not history. Still, she kept her doubts private. Ryan loved Olivia. That was what mattered. Margaret would support her son, even if she harbored reservations. The months leading to the wedding passed in a blur of planning. Olivia took control of every detail. She chose the venue, an exclusive resort. She selected the flowers, the menu, the music. She invited 200 guests, most of whom Margaret had never met. Margaret was consulted on nothing. When she offered suggestions, Olivia smiled and said they had already finalized those decisions. When Margaret asked about inviting friends from her small community, Olivia said the guest list was complete. Margaret felt herself becoming invisible. She was the groom's mother, yet she was treated like an afterthought. She mentioned this to Emily during a phone call. "Mom, maybe she's just stressed about the wedding," Emily had said. "Planning these things is overwhelming." Margaret wanted to believe that. She tried to be patient. She reminded herself that every family had different customs. The Carters moved in different social circles. Their world had different rules. But the engagement party had shattered her patience. That cruel whisper, "Desert pottery lady." The mockery in Olivia's voice, the casual cruelty. And then Ryan's strange response, his insistence that she trust him, his promise that tomorrow would bring understanding. Margaret sat at her pottery wheel now in the quiet dawn and tried to make sense of it all. Her hands shaped clay automatically, muscle memory guiding her movements. A bowl took form beneath her fingers. She thought about the life she had built, the studio, the cottage, the land, 30 years of work, 30 years of survival. She had asked for nothing from anyone. She had earned every inch of this place. Why did Olivia look at her with such contempt? Why did the Carters ask so many questions about her property? And why did Ryan seem to be planning something that required her trust? The bowl on the wheel grew lopsided. Margaret stopped, her concentration broken. She usually never made mistakes. Her hands knew the clay too well. But this morning, her thoughts were too scattered. She cleaned her workspace and stepped outside. The sun was rising over the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The vast emptiness stretched endlessly. She had always loved this view, the solitude, the peace. Now it felt fragile, as if something was about to change forever. Margaret walked back to her house. The wedding was this afternoon. She needed to shower, dress, drive to the venue. She needed to smile and pretend everything was fine. But Ryan's words echoed in her mind. Tomorrow, everything will make sense. Today was tomorrow. Whatever storm was coming, it would arrive in a matter of hours. Margaret remembered the exact moment she first sensed danger. 3 months before the engagement party, Ryan invited her to brunch at the Carter estate. A casual family gathering, he said. A chance to get acquainted. The estate sat behind iron gates in an exclusive neighborhood. Margaret's old truck looked painfully out of place among the luxury vehicles. She parked near the back, hoping to minimize attention. A housekeeper guided her through a marble foyer. Her boots echoed on polished stone. The living room was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens. White furniture arranged with precision. Abstract paintings worth small fortunes. Everything gleamed. Charles Carter stood near the fireplace, scotch in hand, despite the early hour. Tall, silver-haired, radiating confidence. His handshake was firm but brief. Vivian Carter sat on a cream sofa, legs crossed elegantly. Her jewelry caught the light. She offered Margaret a smile that did not reach her eyes. Olivia emerged from another room, phone pressed to her ear. She waved vaguely and continued her conversation. Ryan trailed behind, looking apologetic. Margaret sat in the chair Vivian indicated. The cushion was too firm. She perched on the edge, uncomfortable. Charles began within minutes. How many acres did her property cover? Margaret hesitated. 15 acres, she said. Charles smiled. Must be valuable land. Had she ever had it appraised? Margaret said she had not. The property had been in her late husband's family. She had never considered selling. Vivian leaned forward. Never considered selling? But surely at her age, maintaining such a large property must be exhausting. Margaret bristled. At her age, as if 67 meant incapable. She kept her voice level. The studio kept her active. She had no plans to sell. Charles exchanged a glance with Vivian. Something passed between them that made Margaret's stomach tighten. The questions continued. Annual income from pottery sales, Airbnb guests, property taxes, loans. Margaret felt her face flush. These were not casual questions. These were the questions a banker might ask, or a developer. Ryan tried to redirect the conversation. Charles answered briefly, then returned his attention to Margaret. Did she have a retirement plan? Savings? Investments? Margaret's hands clenched. She had some savings, she said stiffly. Enough. Enough for what? Charles pressed. Medical emergencies? Long-term care? The concern sounded manufactured. Margaret looked at Ryan, silently pleading. Her son's jaw was tight, but he said nothing. Olivia joined them, draping herself on the sofa arm. Are we talking about the pottery studio? Ryan showed me photos. Very rustic. Rustic. The word landed like an insult disguised as a compliment. Vivian continued. That building must be quite old. Issues with structure, plumbing, electrical. Margaret admitted minor repairs over the years. Nothing major. Charles leaned back, studying her with intensity that made her skin crawl. Vivian and I have considerable experience in property management. If you ever need advice about maximizing your asset value, we'd be happy to help. Asset value. Not home, not studio. Asset. Margaret stood abruptly. She thanked them, but said she needed to leave. A kiln firing required attention. Completely untrue. Ryan walked her to her truck. His face was pale. They want my land, Margaret said flatly. Ryan looked torn. Finally, he simply hugged her. I know, Mom, I know. The words confused her. If he knew, why marry into this family? She climbed into her truck and drove away, watching the estate shrink in her rearview mirror. The encounter left her shaken. The Carters had not been making conversation. They had been conducting reconnaissance. Over the following weeks, small incidents accumulated. Olivia visited the studio once, unannounced and unimpressed. She stayed less than 10 minutes, her expression suggesting she smelled something unpleasant. Charles called Margaret directly. He knew an excellent real estate agent. Would Margaret be interested in a free consultation, just to know her options? Margaret declined firmly, but the offer remained open. Vivian sent emails with links to retirement communities. Lovely places, she wrote. Perfect for someone who had worked hard and deserved rest. Each interaction felt like pressure, subtle but persistent, water dripping on stone. Ryan grew quieter during this period. When Margaret visited, he seemed distracted, tense. She asked if everything was all right. He assured her it was fine. But his eyes told a different story. Emily called from up north, concerned. Mom, are you sure about this wedding? Ryan sounds stressed. Margaret admitted reservations about Olivia's family. But Ryan loved Olivia. What could she do? Emily said she would come home early for the wedding. She wanted to be there to support them both. The weeks blurred together, invitations sent, flowers ordered, venue confirmed. The wedding machinery moved forward with unstoppable momentum. Margaret tried to focus on her work. She threw herself into pottery. The clay obeyed her hands. This she could control. But at night, doubts consumed her. She would lie awake, replaying every conversation with the Carters, analyzing every comment. What did they really want? Her land, obviously. But how did they plan to get it? She would never sell voluntarily. Unless, the thought hit her one sleepless night, unless they planned to acquire it through marriage. If Ryan married Olivia, would they pressure him to convince Margaret to sell? Would they manipulate Ryan into betraying his own mother? Love made people do irrational things. Margaret knew that. What if the Carters were counting on that? What if they had chosen Ryan specifically because of his connection to her property? The paranoia felt exhausting. Margaret forced herself to breathe slowly. She was imagining conspiracies, creating problems that did not exist. But the unease would not leave. 3 days before the engagement party, Margaret drove past a construction site on the edge of town. A massive resort was being built. The sign read, Carter Development Group, creating tomorrow's luxury. She pulled over and stared. at the Carter name in bold letters, at the rendering of the planned resort, complete with golf course and spa, at the desert land being scraped bare to make room for profit. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She understood now, completely, terrifyingly. The Carters did not just want her land. They wanted to destroy it, to pave over 3 decades of stewardship, to replace her studio with concrete and chlorine, and they thought marrying into her family would give them access. Margaret called Ryan immediately. She needed to talk, urgently. But Ryan did not answer. She left a message. He did not call back. The next day, she tried again. Ryan finally responded with a text. "Mom, I'm swamped with wedding prep. Can we talk after the engagement party? I promise everything will be okay." Everything will be okay. The words felt hollow. Margaret attended the engagement party with dread pooling in her stomach. She wore her navy dress. She put on her best smile. She walked into that venue, knowing she was entering enemy territory. And then she heard Olivia's cruel whisper, the final confirmation of everything she had feared. These people did not respect her. They mocked her. They saw her as an obstacle to be removed. But what Margaret did not know yet, what she could not have guessed, was that Ryan had heard every word too, and he had been planning his response for months. The engagement party began at 7 in the evening. Margaret arrived 10 minutes early, hoping to find a quiet corner before the crowd gathered. No such luck. The venue was already half filled with guests who moved with practiced grace, champagne glasses in hand, laughter flowing like expensive wine. She recognized no one, not a single face. These were Olivia's people, the Carter family's social circle. Wealth recognized wealth. They spoke the same language, wore the same brands, inhabited the same rarefied world. Margaret stood near the entrance, clutching her small purse. She had changed clothes 3 times before leaving home, finally settling on the navy dress. Now she wished she had chosen something else. The fabric felt cheap under the venue's bright lights. The cut seemed dowdy compared to the silk and satin surrounding her. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne. Margaret took a glass, grateful for something to hold. The bubbles tickled her nose. She took a small sip, barely tasting it. Across the room, Olivia held court near the bar. She wore a white cocktail dress that hugged her figure perfectly. Her blonde hair cascaded over one shoulder. Diamond earrings sparkled. She laughed at something a tall man said, touching his arm lightly. Charming, effortless, born to this. Ryan stood beside her, handsome in a dark suit, but his posture seemed stiff. His smile looked forced. Margaret knew her son well enough to read the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. She wanted to go to him, but hesitated. This was Olivia's night. Margaret was just the groom's mother, a supporting character, expected to smile and stay invisible. More guests arrived. The noise level rose. Conversations blended into a constant hum punctuated by bursts of laughter. Margaret moved along the wall, trying to appear occupied. She studied the floral arrangements. She examined the place settings. She counted the chandeliers. A group of women swept past her, their perfume heavy and cloying. One of them glanced at Margaret, then whispered something to her companions. They all looked back. Margaret caught the tail end of their smiles, polite, pitying. Heat crept up her neck. She turned away, pretending to admire a painting on the wall. Modern art. Splashes of color that meant nothing to her, but she stared at it intently, as if deeply moved. An elegantly dressed woman in her 40s approached. Her smile seemed practiced, calculated. She introduced herself as someone who worked with Olivia. Her eyes traveled over Margaret's dress, her shoes, her simple jewelry. The assessment took seconds, but felt eternal. She mentioned something about the desert, about how peaceful it must be, so far from everything. The emphasis on everything carried weight, far from civilization, far from what mattered. Margaret offered polite responses, then excused herself. She needed air. She found a balcony overlooking the gardens. The night air was cool. She breathed deeply, trying to steady herself. How much longer did she have to stay? An hour? 2? The thought of enduring this for another minute felt exhausting. She heard voices behind her. 2 women had stepped onto the balcony, unaware of her presence in the shadows. Their conversation drifted clearly. Comments about Ryan's mother looking out of place. Remarks about a pottery shop in the middle of nowhere. Questions about where she had found that dress. Soft laughter. Not cruel, exactly. Just casual dismissal. As if Margaret's existence was mildly embarrassing. A social inconvenience. Margaret's hands trembled. Tears stung her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of these people. She waited until the women went back inside. Then she followed, moving quickly through the crowd. She needed to find Ryan. She needed to tell him she was leaving. But before she could reach him, she passed another cluster of Olivia's friends. Their voices carried clearly. Comments about how quaint she seemed, mentions of an adobe hut, more laughter about rusticity. Margaret's vision blurred. The room seemed to tilt. She felt dizzy, disoriented. She needed to get out. Now. She turned toward the exit, but a hand caught her arm. Ryan. His face was pale. His eyes were dark with emotion she could not name. Anger? Guilt? Something deeper? He had heard them. Of course he had. The comments were not exactly whispered. Anyone paying attention would have heard. Margaret started to apologize, to explain she needed to leave. But Ryan's grip on her arm was gentle but firm. He guided her away from the crowd into a quiet alcove near the kitchen entrance. His jaw was set with that same strange determination she had seen the day before. Not embarrassment, not shame, something else entirely. He told her to stay until tomorrow. Please, just until tomorrow. There it was again. That cryptic promise, that insistence on tomorrow. Margaret searched his face, looking for answers. What happens tomorrow? She wanted to ask. But Ryan's expression stopped her. He glanced over his shoulder, ensuring they were alone. When he looked back at her, his eyes held something that made her breath catch. Cold fury, controlled, calculated, terrifying in its intensity. He asked her to trust him. One more day, just one more day. Tomorrow, everything changes. Margaret felt her knees weaken. Whatever Ryan was planning, it was massive. She could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the way his fists clenched and unclenched at his sides. She nodded slowly. She would stay. She would endure whatever came next. Ryan's expression softened slightly. He squeezed her hand once, then released her. He told her to go home, to rest. The wedding was tomorrow afternoon. He would see her there. Margaret watched him walk back into the party. He moved through the crowd with purpose, his face carefully neutral. But she had seen beneath the mask. She knew what lived there now. Rage, pure and righteous. She left through a side door, avoiding the main crowd. Her truck sat alone in the parking lot, lit by a single lamppost. She climbed in and sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel. The night sky stretched endlessly above, stars scattered across the darkness like thrown diamonds. The desert night always brought clarity, always stripped away pretense and revealed truth. Tomorrow, Ryan had said. Tomorrow, everything changes. Margaret started the engine and drove home through the empty roads. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but asphalt and sand. The studio appeared eventually, solid and familiar in the night. She parked and walked to the house. Inside, she poured herself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. Her hands still trembled slightly. The humiliation of the evening clung to her like smoke. But beneath the hurt, something else stirred. Curiosity, anticipation, even a strange kind of hope. Ryan had a plan. She did not know what it was, but she trusted him. She had raised him to be honest, to stand up for what was right, to protect those who could not protect themselves. Tomorrow, he had promised. Tomorrow. Margaret finished her water and went to bed. Sleep came slowly. But when it finally arrived, it brought strange dreams. Dreams of storms gathering, of thunder rolling across the desert, of lightning splitting the sky. In the morning, she woke to brilliant sunshine. The wedding day had arrived. She showered, dressed carefully, applied makeup with steady hands. She chose a different dress this time, something with more color, more presence. If Ryan wanted her there, she would be there, fully, visibly, unashamed. She drove to the venue early, arriving before most guests. The wedding coordinator directed her to a reserved seat in the front row. Margaret sat and watched as the venue transformed. White flowers everywhere, ribbons, candles, an arch covered in roses, everything perfect, everything beautiful, everything about to shatter. Guests began arriving, the same crowd from the engagement party, the same elegant people in expensive clothes. They filled the seats, chatting quietly, checking phones, adjusting jewelry. Margaret sat alone in the front row and waited. Her heart beat steadily. Her breathing remained calm. Whatever was coming, she was ready. Ryan appeared near the altar, looking handsome in his tuxedo. He caught her eye across the venue. He nodded once, a signal, an acknowledgement. The time had come. Music began. The processional. Bridesmaids walked down the aisle in pale pink dresses. Then Olivia appeared, radiant in white, her father beside her. The ceremony began. Words about love and commitment, words about forever, words that rang hollow in Margaret's ears. And then, just as the officiant asked if anyone objected, Ryan raised his hand. The storm broke. The moment froze. Ryan's hand remained raised. Every head in the venue turned toward him. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. The officiant's mouth hung open, words dying on his lips. Olivia's face drained of color. Her bouquet trembled in her hands. Charles and Vivian sat rigid in the front row, their expressions shifting from confusion to alarm in seconds. Ryan lowered his hand slowly. He looked at Olivia, then at her parents, then at the assembled guests. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, steady, terrifyingly controlled. He said there was something everyone needed to see before the ceremony continued, something that could not wait. Margaret's heart hammered. This was it, the storm Ryan had promised. It was a Tuesday evening in late summer. Ryan had stopped by Olivia's apartment to surprise her with dinner. He had a key. They had been engaged for 2 weeks. The future felt bright and certain. He let himself in quietly, carrying takeout containers. He heard voices from the living room. Olivia was on the phone. Her tone was different from usual. Sharp, calculating. Ryan paused in the hallway, not intending to eavesdrop, but unable to move forward without announcing himself. Olivia's words drifted clearly. She was talking about the wedding timeline, about how everything needed to happen quickly, before the old woman changed her mind. Ryan's blood went cold. Old woman. She meant his mother. Olivia continued. She mentioned the 15 acres, prime development location, perfect for the resort expansion her father had been planning. Once they were married, it would be easy to convince Ryan. Family ties, shared assets, legal pathways. Ryan stood frozen in the hallway, takeout containers growing cold in his hands. Olivia laughed then, a sound he had never heard before, cold, victorious. She said something about the pottery studio being easy to demolish, about how sentimental old women always caved under the right pressure, about how Ryan was too soft-hearted to resist for long. The words felt like knives, each one precise, each one deliberate, each one destroying everything Ryan had believed about the woman he loved. He left silently. He set the takeout on the kitchen counter and walked out. Olivia never knew he had been there. Ryan drove aimlessly for hours that night. His mind raced. His hands shook on the steering wheel. Everything made sense suddenly. The rushed engagement, the quick wedding date, the constant questions about his mother's property, Olivia's barely concealed disdain for Margaret's modest lifestyle. He had been a fool, a mark, a means to an end. But more than his own heartbreak, Ryan felt rage at what they planned to do to his mother. Margaret had sacrificed everything for him and Emily. She had worked herself to exhaustion, raising them alone. She had built that studio with her own hands. It was not just property. It was her life, her identity, her legacy, and they wanted to take it, to trick her, to manipulate him into betraying her. Ryan made a decision that night. He would not confront Olivia, not yet. He would gather evidence. He would document everything, and when the moment was right, he would destroy them. The next morning, Ryan went to work as if nothing had changed. He called Olivia and apologized for missing their dinner plans. "Emergency at work," he said. She accepted the excuse easily. But everything had changed. Ryan began paying attention, really paying attention. He noticed how Olivia checked her phone constantly when they were together, how she sometimes stepped away to take calls, how she became evasive when he asked about her day. He started recording their conversations. Not everyone, just the ones where she seemed distracted or secretive. He used a small digital recorder he kept in his jacket pocket. The first real breakthrough came 2 weeks later. Olivia met her parents for lunch at an upscale restaurant. Ryan was supposed to be out of town for work. Instead, he sat 3 tables away, partially hidden by a decorative screen. Charles and Vivian spoke freely, assuming privacy. They discussed the development timeline, how the permits were already in process, how the land acquisition needed to happen within 6 months to meet investor deadlines. Vivian mentioned Margaret specifically. She called her a stubborn old woman who needed careful handling. Charles agreed. He said Ryan was the key. Once married to Olivia, Ryan would be family. Family could be persuaded, pressured, manipulated. Olivia laughed. She said Ryan was already wrapped around her finger. He would do anything she asked, especially if she framed it as financial security for his mother's future. Ryan's hand clenched around his water glass so hard it nearly shattered. But he remained still, silent, recording every word. Over the following months, Ryan collected 23 separate recordings, conversations where the Carters discussed their scheme, where they calculated property values, where they drafted timelines, where they laughed about Margaret's naivety. He also discovered documents. Olivia kept files on her laptop. She was careless with passwords. Ryan found development plans labeled Desert Bloom Acquisition, architectural renderings showing a resort where his mother's studio currently stood, financial projections assuming the land would be acquired at below market value through family coercion. There were also emails, dozens of them, between Charles, Vivian, Olivia, and their lawyers, discussions about legal strategies, about how to structure the marriage agreement, about clauses that would give the Carter family leverage over any property Ryan might inherit. One email made Ryan physically ill. Vivian had written to a lawyer asking about expediting property transfers from elderly owners. The lawyer responded with several options, including something called undue influence claims that could be used if Margaret resisted selling. They were planning to legally bully his mother into giving up her life's work. Ryan copied everything. He stored files in encrypted cloud storage. He made physical backups. He documented dates, times, locations. He built a case that would withstand any legal scrutiny. But evidence alone was not enough. Ryan needed the perfect moment to reveal it. A moment where the Carters could not escape, could not spin the narrative, could not use their wealth and connections to bury the truth. The wedding, Ryan realized, was perfect. 200 witnesses, many of them influential people in the community, including, Ryan had learned, a district attorney who happened to be Olivia's distant cousin. Ryan reached out to the DA privately. He explained the situation. He shared portions of the evidence. The DA listened carefully. He agreed to attend the wedding. He promised that if Ryan's evidence was as solid as it appeared, arrests could be made immediately. Ryan spent weeks preparing the presentation. He enlisted a tech-savvy friend to help compile everything into a seamless video, audio recordings with timestamps, document images, email screenshots, all of it organized chronologically to tell the complete story of the Carter family's conspiracy. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal. Ryan continued playing the role of eager groom. He attended cake tastings and florist appointments. He smiled for engagement photos. He endured Charles's condescending advice and Vivian's passive-aggressive comments. And he watched Olivia, watched her perform affection, watched her plan a wedding that was nothing but theater, watched her prepare to destroy his mother's life. The only person Ryan told was Emily. His sister flew home 2 weeks before the wedding. Ryan showed her everything. Emily cried. Then she became furious. Then she became Ryan's accomplice. Emily helped finalize details. She coordinated with the DA. She ensured Margaret would be present, but unaware. Ryan needed his mother there to see justice happen. But he could not warn her. If Margaret knew, she might try to stop him. She might sacrifice herself to avoid conflict. That was who she was. The night of the engagement party, when Olivia's friends mocked Margaret, Ryan had to physically restrain himself from confronting them immediately. He clenched his fists until his nails drew blood from his palms. He smiled through gritted teeth. He played his role. But when he saw his mother's face, saw the humiliation and pain there, his resolve hardened into something unbreakable. He pulled her aside. He begged her to trust him, to wait one more day. He saw confusion in her eyes, hurt, but also trust. Margaret trusted him. She always had. Ryan would not let her down. Now, standing at the altar on his wedding day, with 200 guests watching, with Olivia staring at him in dawning horror, with her parents frozen in their seats, Ryan felt completely calm. He had spent 3 months preparing for this moment. 3 months collecting evidence, 3 months planning, 3 months waiting. The waiting was over. He turned to the officiant and apologized for the interruption. Then he looked directly at Charles and Vivian. He told them he had discovered something troubling during the engagement period, something that needed to be addressed before any vows were exchanged. Charles started to stand. Ryan held up a hand. He suggested everyone remain seated. This would not take long. But it was important. Critical, even. He pulled a small remote from his jacket pocket. He pressed a button. Behind him, a large screen descended from the ceiling. The venue's audiovisual system, installed for playing a romantic montage during the reception, now served a different purpose. The screen flickered to life, and Ryan pressed play on the truth. The morning after the engagement party, Ryan sat across from Daniel Park in a quiet coffee shop. Daniel was a former college roommate who now worked in digital forensics. If anyone could turn raw evidence into something bulletproof, it was him. Ryan handed over a USB drive. 3 months of recordings, documents, emails, screenshots, everything he had collected on the Carter family's conspiracy. Daniel plugged in the drive and scrolled through the contents. His expression darkened as he listened to audio clips through earbuds. He looked up at Ryan with something between admiration and concern. They spent the day organizing material. Daniel suggested a timeline structure. Start with the earliest evidence, build chronologically to the most damning content, end with the forged documents and illegal acquisition plans. Daniel also insisted on forensic timestamping. Every file needed metadata verification. Defense lawyers would claim manipulation. The timestamps would prove authenticity, would demonstrate nothing had been doctored. They worked through the weekend. Daniel brought specialized software to verify audio authenticity and document origins, technology that would stand up in court. The final product was a 17-minute presentation, audio playing over relevant images, documents appearing in sequence, a devastating narrative of greed and conspiracy. Daniel exported multiple versions and created backups in 3 separate locations. Ryan paid him in cash. Daniel tried to refuse, but Ryan insisted. Professional work deserved professional compensation. Next came District Attorney Lucas Grant. Ryan had researched carefully before reaching out. Grant had a reputation for prosecuting white-collar crime, regardless of the defendant's connections. Ryan requested a meeting through official channels. He explained he had evidence of criminal conspiracy involving property fraud. Grant agreed to meet. They met in Grant's office on a Tuesday afternoon. Ryan played selected portions of the evidence. Grant listened without reaction, his courtroom face revealing nothing. When the clips ended, Grant asked about the recording sources. Ryan explained the circumstances, the accidental discovery, the decision to gather evidence rather than confront immediately. Grant asked about Ryan's relationship to the subjects. Ryan admitted he was engaged to one of them, that the wedding was scheduled for next month. Grant's eyebrows rose. He pointed out this would destroy the engagement, would result in arrests, would create massive scandal. Ryan said he understood completely. That was the point. Grant studied Ryan's face, searching for doubt. He found none. He said the evidence appeared solid but needed full forensic analysis. He would need original files for independent verification. Ryan provided everything. He also explained his plan. To reveal the conspiracy at the wedding, in front of 200 witnesses, with Grant present to take immediate action. Grant initially resisted. Too theatrical, he said. Better to make quiet arrests. Build the case properly. But Ryan argued his position. The Carters had money, connections, influence. If arrested quietly, they would hire expensive lawyers and claim misunderstanding. Public exposure would make denial impossible. Grant asked for time to review everything thoroughly, to ensure the case was absolutely airtight. Ryan agreed to wait. But he made one thing clear. The wedding was happening. The presentation was happening. With or without official involvement. Grant looked at Ryan for a long moment. Then he said he would be there, as a guest, initially. But if the evidence held up in real time, arrests could be made on site. They shook hands. Ryan left feeling a weight lift slightly. The following weeks blurred together. Ryan continued his double life. Dutiful fiancé by day, avenging son by night. He attended venue walkthroughs with Olivia, nodded as she discussed floral arrangements and seating charts, smiled as she reviewed reception timelines. All the while, knowing every detail would become irrelevant. Olivia seemed energized by the planning. She talked constantly about the wedding, about the guest list, about social connections being forged. She never mentioned love. Ryan noticed that. She never spoke about marriage itself, about partnership, about building a life together. It was always about the event, about appearances. Ryan played along, agreed with her choices, complimented her decisions, acted the supportive groom. But at night, alone, he reviewed the presentation repeatedly, checked every transition, every audio cue, every timestamp, memorized the sequence, prepared for technical failures. Emily flew in 4 days before the wedding. Ryan showed her the final presentation. She watched in silence, tears streaming by the end. When it finished, Emily's voice was steady despite her red eyes. She said it was perfect, devastating and perfect. They discussed logistics. Emily would sit with Margaret during the ceremony, would support her when the revelation happened, would shield her from chaos. Emily also volunteered to coordinate with venue staff. Someone needed to ensure the audiovisual equipment was properly set up, that the screen would descend on cue, that sound would broadcast clearly. She visited the venue 2 days before the wedding, introduced herself to the AV technician as the groom's sister, said she wanted to review equipment for the reception slideshow. The technician showed her everything. Emily memorized the controls. She also secretly provided Ryan's custom remote, a device Daniel had programmed to override standard controls. The night before the wedding, Ryan could not sleep. Tomorrow, everything changed. Tomorrow, he would publicly destroy a family, create a scandal that would reverberate for years. He thought about backing out, simply calling off the wedding, walking away. But then he thought about Margaret, about her face at the engagement party, about the contempt in Olivia's voice, about people who saw others as obstacles to profit. His resolve hardened. This was not revenge. This was protection. About ensuring the Carters never hurt anyone again. Ryan checked his equipment one final time. Remote control. Backup remote. Backup drive. Everything ready. He resisted calling Margaret to warn her. She would try to stop him. would sacrifice herself rather than see him go through this. Morning came. Ryan, dressed in his tailored tuxedo, arrived at the venue early, checked the AV equipment personally, loaded his presentation, tested the remote. Everything worked perfectly. Guests began arriving. Ryan greeted them with calm smiles, shook hands, accepted congratulations, played his role one final time. He saw Margaret arrive, watched her take her seat in the front row. She looked nervous but dignified in a colorful outfit that showed more confidence than before. She caught his eye and smiled. Ryan smiled back, hoped she would forgive him for the shock, for the public nature of what was coming. The ceremony began. Music played. Bridesmaids walked. Then Olivia appeared, beautiful and radiant and completely unaware. She walked down the aisle on Charles's arm. Vivian dabbed at her eyes, performing maternal emotion. They were good actors. They had almost fooled Ryan completely. Almost. The officiant began speaking about love and commitment. Ryan barely heard. His hand rested in his pocket, fingers wrapped around the remote. He waited for the perfect moment, the pause before the vows, when everyone's attention would be completely focused. The officiant turned to Ryan, began to ask if he took Olivia as his lawfully wedded wife. Ryan raised his hand. The storm was about to break. The officiant blinked, confused. His prepared words died on his lips. He looked from Ryan to Olivia to the assembled guests, searching for guidance. Olivia's face shifted through emotions rapidly. Confusion, irritation, then fear, quickly masked with a forced smile. She asked what he was doing, her voice tight and artificially light. Ryan did not respond. He turned to face the crowd. 200 faces stared back. Expensive suits and designer dresses. Champagne-fed smiles beginning to fade into uncertainty. He apologized for the interruption. His voice carried clearly through the lapel microphone. He said there was something everyone needed to see before any vows were exchanged. Charles stood abruptly. His face flushed red. He demanded to know what this nonsense was. Ryan pulled the small remote from his pocket. He pressed the button. Behind him, mechanical whirring filled the silence. The projection screen descended from the ceiling, unfurling like a white sail. The venue lights dimmed automatically. Vivian grabbed Charles's arm, pulling him back down. Her perfectly composed face showed cracks. Her eyes darted between Ryan and the screen. Olivia stepped toward Ryan. Her bouquet trembled. She whispered something urgent, but he ignored her completely. The screen glowed white, then black. Then text appeared in bold letters. Margaret sat frozen in the front row, hands gripping the armrests. Emily sat beside her, covering her mother's hand with her own. The first audio clip began. Olivia's voice, crystal clear through the expensive sound system. Talking on the phone. Laughing about the desert pottery lady at the engagement party. Hoping she did not smell like clay. Commenting about thrift store clothes. The timestamp displayed clearly. 3 months ago. The real Olivia, standing at the altar in white, went pale. She shook her head violently. The screen shifted. Charles's voice now. He was discussing Desert Bloom property, 15 prime acres, perfect for resort expansion. The old woman would never sell voluntarily. But once Ryan married into the family, there were ways. Legal pressures, financial incentives, emotional manipulation. Vivian's voice joined. Sentimental old women always caved eventually, especially when their children were involved. A few strategic moves, and the property would be theirs within a year. Margaret's chest rose and fell rapidly. Several guests turned to look at her, then back at the screen. More recordings followed in succession. The Carter conspiracy laid bare. Olivia laughing about manipulating Ryan, how his environmental conscience made him predictable, how she just had to pretend to care about conservation, how the wedding was moving faster than planned, but that was good. Get the ring on before he figured anything out. Charles, discussing forged property assessments, how they could pressure Margaret into selling cheap if she thought she was helping Ryan's financial future. Vivian on the phone with a lawyer, asking about legal mechanisms to force property transfers from elderly owners, asking specifically about cognitive decline claims, whether they could argue Margaret was not competent to manage valuable assets. Multiple guests gasped audibly. The implication was monstrous. The screen shifted to documents. Development plans labeled Desert Bloom Acquisition. Architectural renderings showing a massive resort, swimming pools, golf course, luxury villas, all superimposed on satellite images of Margaret's property. The pottery studio marked for demolition. The adobe house marked for removal. The desert landscape marked for complete transformation. Olivia screamed that this was fake, that Ryan had manufactured everything, that this was illegal. But the screen showed forensic analysis reports, digital signatures proving the audio files were authentic, metadata showing exact dates and devices, expert testimony from certified analysts confirming verification. A respected digital forensics firm logo appeared. Their certification carried legal weight. Email screenshots appeared next. Communications between Charles, Vivian, Olivia, and their legal team. Discussions about the wedding timeline, about getting Ryan committed before he thought too carefully, about isolating him from his mother's influence. One email from Olivia to Vivian stood out. She wrote about Margaret being the biggest obstacle, how she needed to be made to feel inferior, made to believe she was a burden. Then she would accept any solution that relieved that burden. The cruelty was calculated, systematic, designed to destroy an elderly woman's confidence. Margaret made a small, strangled sound. Emily pulled her close, but Margaret's eyes remained fixed on the screen. The venue erupted in whispers, shocked murmurs spreading. Phones appeared everywhere. Guests recording the screen, recording faces, recording the collapse of respectability. Olivia lunged toward the control booth. She screamed for someone to stop it. But venue staff stood frozen, unsure. This was not malfunction. This was intentional. Charles stood again. He shouted that this was slander, that Ryan would be sued, that the Carters had the best lawyers money could buy. Ryan spoke calmly, his voice amplified. He said Charles was welcome to sue. Discovery would be fascinating. All this evidence would enter public record, along with whatever else investigators found when they looked deeper into Carter Development Group practices. Charles's face went from red to purple. The presentation concluded. The final slide showed summary statistics, 23 recordings, 47 emails, 16 fraudulent documents, 3 months of systematic conspiracy to commit property fraud and elder exploitation. The screen went black. Lights came up. Silence descended. 200 people sat motionless, processing what they had witnessed. Only Olivia's ragged breathing broke the quiet. Then a man stood from the third row. Tall, gray-haired, understated suit. Lucas Grant. He identified himself as district attorney. He stated that based on evidence presented and based on investigation his office had been conducting for 2 weeks, there was sufficient probable cause. He looked at Charles and Vivian. They were being detained for questioning regarding conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted coercion, and elder exploitation. He turned to Olivia. She was similarly detained as co-conspirator. 2 uniformed officers appeared from the back. They had been waiting the entire time in plain clothes. The venue exploded into chaos. Olivia screamed. She dropped her bouquet and ran toward Ryan, finger pointed like a weapon. She called him a liar, a manipulator. She said he had ruined everything. Ryan stood still. His face showed no triumph, just exhaustion. The exhaustion of carrying secrets for 3 months, of pretending, of waiting. Vivian started crying, loud theatrical sobs. She claimed they had done nothing wrong, that this was misunderstanding, that lawyers would clear everything up. Charles tried to run, actually tried to push past guests toward an exit. An officer intercepted him easily. Charles struggled briefly, then went limp. Guests were on their feet, some filming, some calling others, some trying to leave, some pressing closer. The orderly ceremony had disintegrated into pandemonium. Margaret sat motionless through it all. She watched Olivia being led away in handcuffs, watched Charles and Vivian being separated and detained, watched the woman who would have been her daughter-in-law screaming at her son. Emily held her mother tightly. Margaret did not respond. She seemed in shock, face blank, body rigid. Ryan finally moved. He walked down from the altar, removed his microphone and handed it to a bewildered videographer. Then he went to his mother. He knelt in front of her chair, took both her hands. She looked at him as if seeing a stranger. Ryan's eyes filled with tears, the first emotion he had shown. His voice cracked. He apologized. Sorry for secrets, sorry for the spectacle, sorry for everything. But he could not let them take her land, could not let them destroy what she built. Margaret stared at him. Then, slowly, her hand moved to cup his face. Her thumb brushed away a tear. She did not speak. But something in her expression softened. Shock giving way to understanding, to recognition, to pride. Around them, chaos continued. Police securing the scene, guests filing out in confused clusters, event staff standing helplessly amid ruins of a reception that would never happen. But in that small space, mother and son sat together, connected by 3 decades of shared history, by trust tested but not broken. The storm had arrived, just as Ryan promised, and Margaret had survived it. The officers moved with practiced efficiency. One approached Charles and stated he was being detained for questioning, that he had the right to remain silent, that anything he said could be used in court. Charles's face contorted with rage. This was outrageous. He knew the mayor, he knew judges. This would not stand. The officer remained unmoved. He asked Charles to place his hands behind his back. Charles refused. The officer repeated the request, firmer. Charles looked around wildly for allies. He found only phones pointed at him, recording everything. The handcuffs clicked shut. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Several guests flinched. Vivian was next. She had stopped crying. Now she sat rigid, her face a mask of cold fury. When the officer approached, she stood with exaggerated dignity. She extended her wrists as if this was her choice, as if she retained control. But her hands trembled. Her eyes darted toward the exit. The officer positioned himself between her and the door. Olivia backed away when officers approached. Her white dress rustled. She shook her head violently, blonde hair coming loose from its styling. She pointed at Ryan and screamed that he had destroyed her life, that she loved him and he had betrayed her. Ryan stood motionless. His face showed nothing, just terrible blankness. An officer reached for Olivia's arm. She jerked away and tried to run. Her heavy dress tangled around her legs. She stumbled. The officer caught her easily. Olivia collapsed then. Let the officer guide her hands back. Let the cuffs be applied. But her eyes remained fixed on Ryan with pure hatred. The 3 Carters were escorted toward the exit. They had to walk past rows of guests, past people they had invited, people now witnessing their complete downfall. Phones followed them, guest after guest recording. The footage would be online within minutes. Charles walked with his head up, jaw set, but his eyes flickered nervously, calculating consequences. Vivian walked like a woman in a trance, her expensive shoes clicking, her jewelry sparkling, but her face had gone gray. She looked suddenly old. Olivia simply wept, loud, ugly crying, her makeup running in dark streaks, her perfect wedding ruined, her future demolished. The venue doors closed behind them. The sound echoed through the suddenly quiet space. For a moment, no one moved. Then everyone started talking at once, excited, shocked, horrified, fascinated. Margaret remained seated. She had not moved since Ryan knelt before her. Her face showed no expression. Emily crouched beside her. She asked if Margaret was all right, if she needed water, air, if she wanted to leave. Margaret did not respond. She seemed disconnected from her body. An older woman approached Ryan. She told him that was the bravest thing she had ever seen, that what he did took extraordinary courage, that his mother should be proud. Ryan blinked, surprised. He had expected anger, accusations of cruelty, but the woman's face showed only admiration. She moved past him toward Margaret. She knelt beside Emily and introduced herself as Patricia. She owned a gallery in town, had bought pieces from Desert Bloom's studio. She asked if Margaret needed anything. Margaret's eyes focused slightly. She looked at Patricia as if seeing her for the first time. More guests began gathering. Not everyone. Some slipped out quickly, wanting no association with scandal, but a surprising number stayed. Formed a loose circle around the Hayes family. They offered support, shared stories of dealing with aggressive developers, expressed disgust at the Carter family's behavior, praised Ryan's actions. A younger woman approached Margaret directly. She said her grandmother had been pressured by developers years ago, made to feel incompetent. The experience had broken her spirit. The woman's eyes were wet. She wished someone had stood up for her grandmother the way Ryan stood up for Margaret. She said Margaret was lucky. Margaret's face finally showed emotion. Her eyes filled with tears, not from shame or shock now, but relief, gratitude. Emily helped her mother stand. Margaret's legs were unsteady. She swayed. Emily and Patricia both steadied her. Ryan finally reached them. He stood awkwardly, uncertain, waiting to see if his mother would forgive him. Margaret looked at her son. She reached out with one trembling hand, but they carried everything. Ryan's composure broke. He buried his face in his mother's shoulder. His body shook with silent sobs. All the tension of 3 months released. Margaret held him. She was smaller than her son, but in that moment she seemed to grow, to become the sheltering presence she had been throughout his childhood. The gathered guests gave them space, turned away to grant privacy, but they remained nearby. A protective circle. The venue staff began dismantling decorations, taking down flowers, removing place settings. They worked quietly, respectfully. Emily stood guard beside her mother and brother. She scanned the crowd constantly, watching for threats. Patricia was particularly insistent. She pressed her card into Margaret's hand. She said her lawyer had experience with property rights cases. She would make introductions, pro bono if necessary. Margaret accepted the card numbly. District Attorney Grant approached before leaving. He said the investigation would continue, that they would need formal statements, that the case was strong. He also said Ryan should expect media attention. This story would make headlines. Ryan should prepare. Ryan nodded. He had known the consequences. He accepted them. Grant turned to Margaret. He told her she was safe, that the Carters could not threaten her property, that the law would protect her now, that she had a good son. Margaret managed a small smile. She agreed. She had a very good son. Grant left with the officers. The venue continued emptying. Within 30 minutes, only a handful of people remained. Emily suggested they leave. Go somewhere quiet. Process everything away from this place. Ryan agreed. He helped his mother toward the exit. She walked slowly, leaning on him, each step requiring conscious effort. Outside, the evening air was cool. The sun hung low, painting the sky orange and purple. The desert stretched endlessly in the distance. Margaret paused on the venue steps. She looked out at that familiar landscape, at the vast emptiness that had always brought her peace. Ryan asked if she was all right. She did not answer immediately. She just stood there, breathing, letting the desert air fill her lungs. Finally, she spoke. She said she wanted to go home, to her studio, to her small adobe house, to the place the Carters had tried to take from her, to the place that was still hers. Ryan and Emily helped her into Emily's rental car. They drove through the darkening evening toward Desert Bloom's studio. None of them spoke. Words felt inadequate. Behind them, the venue lights went dark. The site of the wedding that became an execution. The place where secrets died and truth survived. The storm had passed, and somehow the Hayes family remained standing. The drive to Desert Bloom's studio took 40 minutes. Emily drove carefully through darkening desert roads. Ryan sat in back with Margaret. Neither spoke. The silence felt necessary. Margaret stared out the window. Sagebrush and sand stretched endlessly under fading light. The same view she had seen for 30 years. Somehow it looked different now, more precious. The studio appeared in the distance, the hand-painted sign catching the last rays of sunlight. Desert Bloom Studio. Words she had painted herself 3 decades ago. Emily parked near the main building. Margaret stood for a moment, just looking at her property. The workshop, the kiln, the small adobe house, all of it still here, still hers. She had come so close to losing it without knowing. The Carters would have taken everything through manipulation and legal tricks, would have demolished her life's work and built luxury condos on the bones of her dreams. Ryan came to stand beside her. He looked exhausted. His tuxedo jacket hung open. His eyes were red. Margaret reached for his hand. They stood together, looking at what they had protected. Emily suggested going inside, making tea, sitting down properly. Margaret nodded slowly. The small house was exactly as Margaret had left it that morning, a lifetime ago, before the wedding, before everything changed. Emily filled the kettle. Ryan helped Margaret to the worn sofa. She sank into the cushions with a sigh that seemed to come from her soul. The house was cluttered with pottery, finished pieces, works in progress. Clay dust covered every surface. The smell of earth and glaze permeated everything. This was home, and someone had tried to steal it. Emily brought tea in chipped mugs Margaret had made years ago. They sat together in the small living room. The silence stretched, but did not feel uncomfortable. Finally, Margaret spoke. Her voice was quiet, but steady. She asked Ryan when he had found out, when he had learned what the Carters were planning. Ryan set down his mug. He told her about the night 3 months ago, arriving at Olivia's apartment with dinner, overhearing the phone conversation, realizing everything had been a lie. Margaret listened without interrupting. Her hands trembled slightly around her mug. Ryan described the months of gathering evidence, the recordings, the documents, the coordination with the district attorney, every step he had taken to build an unbreakable case. He told her about the hardest part, pretending everything was normal, continuing to play the eager groom, watching Olivia plan a wedding that was nothing but theater designed to facilitate theft. His voice cracked when he described the engagement party, hearing Olivia's friends mock his mother, seeing the humiliation on Margaret's face, wanting to confront them immediately but knowing he had to wait. Margaret squeezed his hand. She understood now why he had been so strange, so insistent that she trust him. Ryan looked at his mother with anguished eyes. He apologized again, for the secrecy, for the public spectacle, for putting her through the stress of attending that wedding not knowing what would happen. But he explained his reasoning. If he had warned her, she would have tried to stop him, would have been willing to sacrifice herself to avoid conflict. That was who she was. Ryan could not allow that, could not let her give up her life's work, could not stand by while predators circled his mother. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Not pain now, something deeper, pride, gratitude, overwhelming love for this son who had protected her so completely. She told him she understood, that she was not angry, that what he did took extraordinary courage. Ryan broke down. He had been so afraid she would hate him for the method he chose, for the public humiliation. Margaret pulled him close. She told him she could never hate him, that he had saved her, that he was her hero. They held each other and cried. Emily watched from across the room, tears streaming down her own face. After a while, the tears subsided. They sat back, exhausted, but somehow lighter. Emily asked practical questions. What happened next? What would the legal process look like? Ryan explained what he knew. The Carters would be formally charged within days, multiple felony counts, conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted coercion, possibly elder abuse charges. The case would take months to prosecute. There would be hearings, possibly a trial. Ryan and Margaret would need to give depositions, would need to testify. It would be exhausting. The media would cover it extensively. Their lives would be scrutinized publicly. But the alternative had been worse. The alternative had been losing everything silently. Margaret asked about Olivia. Her voice was surprisingly gentle. Despite everything, Margaret felt sadness. Olivia had destroyed her own life through greed. Ryan's face hardened. He said Olivia had made her choices, had participated willingly, had laughed about manipulating him. But it was still sad. So much potential wasted. They talked late into the night, processing, planning, occasionally falling into comfortable silence. Emily made sandwiches from whatever she found in Margaret's refrigerator. They ate mechanically, needing fuel. Around midnight, Emily said she should find a hotel, but Margaret insisted she stay. The guest cottage was empty. They should stay together tonight. Family should be together. Ryan said he would stay too. He could sleep on the sofa. He did not want to leave his mother alone. Margaret protested weakly, but was secretly relieved. She did not want to be alone either. Not tonight. They prepared for bed slowly. Emily walked to the guest cottage. Ryan found blankets for the sofa. Margaret changed into comfortable clothes in her bedroom. She stood at her bedroom window looking out at the dark desert. Stars scattered across the sky. The night was silent except for distant coyote calls. She thought about how close she had come to losing all of this. This view, this peace, this life she had built from nothing. The Carters had seen her property as an asset to be acquired, had seen her as an obstacle to be removed. She calculated her worth in dollars and found her expendable. But Ryan had seen differently, had seen his mother as someone worth protecting, had been willing to sacrifice his own happiness to keep her safe. Margaret felt overwhelming gratitude, and also strange peace. The storm had come, the danger had been real, but she had survived. She climbed into bed. For the first time in months, she felt safe, truly safe. The threat was gone, the predators were in custody, her land was secure. In the living room, Ryan lay on the sofa, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced despite his exhaustion. So many things still to deal with: legal proceedings, media attention, the wreckage of his personal life. But underneath the anxiety was something else: relief. He had done what needed doing, had protected his mother, had exposed criminals, had chosen truth over comfort. He thought about Olivia, about the woman he thought he knew versus the woman she actually was, about how completely he had been fooled. It hurt, even knowing what she had planned, even seeing her arrested. Part of him still grieved for the relationship he thought he had. But that person had never existed, had been a performance. Ryan forced himself to breathe slowly, to let it go. Anger would not help now. He needed to focus on moving forward, on supporting his mother through what came next. He finally fell asleep near dawn. Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through her window. For a moment, she forgot everything. Then memory returned. The wedding, the revelation, the arrests. She lay in bed, testing her emotions, waiting to feel devastated. Instead, she felt strangely calm, clear-headed, ready. She rose and dressed, walked to her kitchen and started coffee. The familiar routine grounded her. Ryan appeared, rumpled and bleary. He looked younger somehow, vulnerable. Margaret hugged him without words. Emily joined them shortly after. They sat together at Margaret's small kitchen table, drinking coffee, eating toast, not talking much, but comfortable in the silence. They were family. They had survived. And whatever came next, they would face together. Outside, the desert morning blazed, bright and clear. A new day, a new beginning. The storm had passed. The morning after the wedding, Margaret's phone rang before 7. Unfamiliar numbers. Then another call, then another. Ryan checked his phone. 23 missed calls, 47 text messages. His voicemail was full. The story had spread overnight. News outlets across the state picked it up. Wedding arrest. Developers exposed. Mother saved by son's revelation. The narrative was irresistible. By noon, 2 television vans parked outside Desert Bloom Studio. Reporters knocked repeatedly. Margaret stayed inside, while Ryan dealt with them. He made a brief statement, asked for privacy, said they would cooperate with law enforcement. Then he locked the door. But the media attention was just the beginning. Something far more significant was unfolding at the district attorney's office. Lucas Grant sat at his desk surrounded by file folders. His phone had been ringing since dawn. Not from reporters, from victims. From people who heard about the Carter arrest and recognized patterns from their own experiences. The first call came at 6 a.m. A man named Robert Chen. He owned a small manufacturing business. 5 years ago, he entered partnership with Carter Development Group. They promised investment, expansion opportunities. Instead, they systematically stripped his company, diverted funds, created false debts. Within 18 months, Robert was forced into bankruptcy. The Carters acquired his property for pennies, built a shopping complex where his factory once stood. Robert had tried to fight legally, but the Carters had expensive lawyers. They buried him in paperwork. Eventually, he gave up, broken. He had been watching news coverage all morning, watching Charles and Vivian led away in handcuffs. He felt something he had not felt in 5 years. Hope. Grant listened carefully, took notes, asked Robert to send any documentation, emails, contracts, financial records. The second call came 20 minutes later. A woman named Sarah Martinez. She and her husband owned a bed and breakfast in the mountains. Prime location, stunning views, built over 15 years. The Carters approached with an offer to invest, to help expand. Sarah and her husband signed agreements they did not fully understand, agreements that gave the Carters increasing control. Within a year, the Carters claimed the business was failing, demanded repayment of loans Sarah had not known existed, threatened foreclosure. Sarah and her husband lost everything. The bed and breakfast became a luxury private residence. Sarah's voice shook telling Grant her story. She said she and her husband nearly divorced over the stress, lost their retirement savings, their health suffered. She wanted justice. Grant assured her the investigation was expanding, that her story mattered. More calls followed throughout the morning. A small-town mayor pressured to approve questionable zoning changes. A contractor blackmailed into falsifying inspection reports. An elderly couple tricked into signing over mineral rights. Each story revealed the same pattern. The Carters identified targets, established seemingly legitimate relationships, then slowly tightened their grip, used legal complexity to confuse, used financial pressure to coerce, used reputation to intimidate. By midday, Grant had documented 17 potential victims, 17 cases spanning 8 years, 17 families destroyed or damaged by Carter greed. He called his supervisor, explained what was emerging. This was not just about Margaret Hayes anymore. This was systematic fraud, a criminal enterprise operating under cover of legitimate business. His supervisor authorized expanding the investigation. Additional prosecutors were assigned. Forensic accountants brought in. Subpoenas prepared for Carter Development Group's financial records going back a decade. By late afternoon, the story grew beyond local news. State media picked it up. National outlets began calling. The wedding arrest was sensational. But the expanding criminal conspiracy was genuine scandal. Television reporters stood outside the courthouse describing a widening investigation. They interviewed legal experts who explained potential charges: fraud, racketeering, conspiracy. The Carters could face decades in prison. Social media exploded with discussion. People shared their own experiences with predatory developers. Others praised Ryan's courage. Margaret's photos circulated widely. The elderly woman nearly victimized by wealth and power, a symbol of vulnerability exploited. At Desert Bloom's studio, Margaret watched news coverage with growing disbelief. She had known the Carters were bad. But this was beyond what she imagined. They had done this to others, many others, had perfected their methods over years, had destroyed lives systematically and without remorse. Margaret thought about how close she had come, how easily she could have been just another victim, another elderly person stripped of their life's work. Ryan sat beside his mother. He pointed at the television, where a reporter described Robert Chen's case. He said this was why he chose public exposure, why he made the revelation so dramatic. If handled quietly, the Carters would have hired lawyers, would have negotiated settlements, would have buried truth in confidential agreements. Their other victims would never have known, would never have come forward. But the public arrest changed everything, gave victims permission to speak, showed them the Carters could be challenged. That power and wealth did not make someone untouchable. Margaret understood now. Ryan had not just protected her. He had started an avalanche, had given voice to years of silent suffering, had created opportunity for justice on a scale none of them anticipated. Emily came in with her laptop. She had been reading online coverage. She showed Margaret and Ryan comment sections. Hundreds of people sharing support, sharing their own stories of corporate exploitation, expressing gratitude that someone finally stood up. But there were critics. Some said Ryan's methods were cruel, that humiliating Olivia publicly was excessive, that he could have handled it differently. Ryan's jaw tightened. Emily closed the laptop. She told him not to engage, not to let critics undermine what he accomplished. Margaret agreed. She said Ryan made the right choice, the only choice that would truly protect her and others. She was proud of him. The next morning, Grant called Ryan directly. He said the investigation was growing faster than anticipated, more victims coming forward daily. The scope was now multi-state: Arizona, Nevada, Colorado. The Carters had operated across the region. Grant said the evidence Ryan provided was proving invaluable. The recordings established pattern and intent, showed premeditation, made it impossible for the Carters to claim misunderstandings. The prosecution was building a comprehensive case, not just for what they planned to do to Margaret, but for what they had done to dozens of others over nearly a decade. Grant said Ryan and Margaret would still need to testify. Their case would likely serve as centerpiece, the most recent and best documented example of Carter criminality. But they would not be alone. Ryan thanked Grant and relayed the conversation to his mother and sister. Margaret felt something shift inside her. She was not just a victim, she was a catalyst. Her near miss had exposed much larger crime. Days passed. The investigation continued expanding. Forensic accountants found hidden accounts, shell companies. Money moved between entities to disguise fraud. More victims came forward. A rancher who lost his land, a restaurateur forced into bankruptcy, a tribal council pressured to sell sacred land. Each story added weight to the prosecution's case. The Carters remained in custody. Bail was set extremely high. Charles's lawyers argued strenuously for release. The judge denied it. Olivia was eventually released on bail after her parents put up remaining property as collateral. But she wore an ankle monitor, surrendered her passport, reported weekly to a probation officer. Margaret saw Olivia's photo in the newspaper. She looked haggard, diminished. Nothing like the confident woman who mocked her at the engagement party. Margaret felt no satisfaction, just sadness for wasted potential. 2 weeks after the wedding, Margaret returned to work in her studio. She needed normalcy, needed to feel clay under her fingers, needed to create something after so much destruction. She sat at her wheel and began shaping a bowl. The familiar motion calmed her. The clay responded to her touch. Obedient, honest, unlike people who smiled while plotting betrayal. Emily extended her stay. She worked remotely from the guest cottage, helped field media requests, managed practical details Margaret struggled with. Ryan visited daily. He was staying in town until the immediate crisis passed. His employer gave him extended leave. The three of them formed a tight unit, eating meals together, watching news together, processing ongoing revelations together. They were family. Margaret stood one evening on her porch watching the sunset. The desert stretched endless and beautiful. The sky blazed orange and purple. She thought about all the victims coming forward, all the lives the Carters damaged, all the families they destroyed in pursuit of profit. She thought about how easily she could have been just another number, another elderly woman erased from her own property. But Ryan had seen, had acted, had refused to let it happen quietly. And now, because of his courage, others were finding their voices. Others were seeking justice. The Carters' empire was crumbling not because of one case, but because of many. Margaret whispered to the desert wind a quiet thank you. For her son, for her daughter, for survival. The investigation would continue. The legal process would be long and difficult. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Margaret felt something new. Not just relief, not just gratitude, but purpose. Her story mattered, her survival mattered, and she would use it to ensure the Carters never hurt anyone again. 4 months after the wedding arrest, the trial began. The courthouse downtown was packed from early morning. Reporters lined the steps. Camera crews claimed positions. Spectators filled every seat in the gallery. Margaret arrived with Ryan and Emily. They walked through flashing cameras and shouted questions. Ryan kept his hand on his mother's elbow. Margaret kept her eyes forward, her face composed. Inside, the courtroom felt solemn and electric. Wood paneling absorbed sound. High ceilings created echoes. The judge's bench loomed imposing. Charles, Vivian, and Olivia sat at the defense table with their legal team. 3 attorneys in expensive suits, folders stacked, laptops open. They looked prepared. But the defendants themselves looked diminished. Charles had lost weight. His suit hung loose. His silver hair seemed grayer. The confidence that once defined him had evaporated. Vivian sat rigid, her jewelry understated now. She wore a simple dark dress meant to convey humility. But her eyes remained hard. Olivia looked worst of all, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back severely, no makeup. She had aged years in 4 months. Margaret sat in the front row. She wore a simple blue dress, her hands folded in her lap. She avoided eye contact with the Carters. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Judge Patricia Hendricks was in her 60s, with steel gray hair and a reputation for running a tight courtroom. The prosecution began their opening statement. Lead prosecutor Jennifer Cole was mid-40s, sharp-eyed, with a voice that carried authority. She outlined the case methodically. 3 defendants engaged in systematic fraud spanning nearly a decade. 17 documented victims, millions in damages, a pattern of predatory behavior disguised as legitimate business. She described the Carter method. Identify vulnerable targets. Establish trust through generous offers. Then slowly tighten control through complex contracts. Strip assets. Force sales. Move on. She spoke about Margaret Hayes, an elderly widow, a hard-working potter, nearly tricked into surrendering her life's work, saved only by her son's courage. Jennifer Cole sat down. The courtroom buzzed. The defense attorney stood. Marcus Webb, one of the most expensive criminal lawyers in the state. Tall, silver-tongued, known for winning impossible cases. He began with sympathy. His clients were successful business people. They had built an empire through hard work. Yes, some deals went badly. That was the nature of business. Bad deals were not crimes. He attacked the recordings, said they were taken without consent, manipulated to sound worse than they were. He promised expert testimony that would cast doubt. He painted Ryan as a vengeful ex-fiancé, someone willing to destroy lives to punish his former lover. The wedding revelation was not heroism, Marcus claimed. It was cruelty. He spoke smoothly, confidently, making eye contact with jurors, selling doubt. The trial proceeded over days. The prosecution called witnesses systematically. Robert Chen testified first. He described his manufacturing business, how the Carters promised partnership but delivered exploitation, how he lost everything. He brought documents, contracts showing impossible terms, financial records showing unexplained transfers, emails where Charles discussed stripping assets. Marcus Webb cross-examined aggressively. He suggested Robert was a poor businessman, that his company failed due to his own mistakes. Robert held his ground. The documents spoke for themselves. Sarah Martinez testified next. She wept, describing her lost bed and breakfast, the business she and her husband built over 15 years. all destroyed by Carter greed. More victims followed, each story similar, each voice adding weight. Then came expert witnesses. A forensic accountant analyzed Carter Development Group's finances. He found shell companies, hidden accounts, money laundering patterns, financial complexity designed to obscure theft. A digital forensics expert testified about Ryan's recordings. He had examined every file, run authentication tests. His conclusion was unequivocal. The recordings were genuine, unaltered, authentic. Marcus Webb challenged him aggressively, asked about editing software, about AI voice generation, about manipulation possibilities. The expert remained calm, explained his methodology, the technical impossibility of faking the specific metadata patterns, the voice analysis showing no synthesis, the timestamps verified through multiple independent sources. His findings would withstand any scrutiny. The recordings were real. Then the prosecution played the recordings again, just the most damning excerpts. Olivia laughing about manipulating Ryan, Charles planning to strip Margaret's assets, Vivian discussing forged documents. Hearing the voices again in the formal courtroom made them even more chilling. This was the defendants, in their own words, planning crimes. Several jurors looked at the defense table with visible disgust. Margaret felt her chest tighten, listening to Olivia mock her, hearing herself described as an obstacle, a problem to be solved. Ryan squeezed her hand. She squeezed back, grateful. The prosecution rested after 2 weeks. The evidence was stacked high. The defense called witnesses, character witnesses mostly, business associates who praised Charles's ethics, friends who described Vivian's charity work, colleagues who vouched for Olivia's integrity. But under cross-examination, many admitted they had never actually done business with the Carters, had never seen their financial records, were testifying based on social impressions rather than actual knowledge. The defense also called their own experts, a digital forensics specialist who suggested the recordings might have been edited. But under questioning, he admitted he had not actually examined the original files, was speculating based on general possibilities. His testimony fell flat. Then Marcus Webb made his final gamble. He called Olivia to the stand. The courtroom went silent. This was risky. Defendants rarely testified, but Marcus clearly believed Olivia could win sympathy. Olivia walked to the witness stand slowly. She wore a conservative dress. She looked young and vulnerable. Marcus questioned her gently, asked about her relationship with Ryan. She described falling in love, planning a future, being blindsided by his betrayal. She denied any conspiracy, said the recordings were taken out of context, that family conversations were being twisted into criminal plots. She wept as she spoke, dabbed at her eyes, painted herself as a victim of Ryan's vindictiveness. Some jurors looked sympathetic. Marcus seemed pleased. Then Jennifer Cole stood for cross-examination. Her first question was simple. Had Olivia ever discussed acquiring Margaret's property? Olivia hesitated, then admitted there had been discussions. Family conversations about potential investments. Jennifer played an audio clip. Olivia's voice clearly stating that once married, they would have leverage over Ryan to pressure Margaret into selling. Was that a family conversation about potential investments? Olivia's face paled. She said it sounded worse than it was, just venting frustration. Jennifer played another clip. Olivia laughing about Margaret being an obstacle, about the pottery studio being easy to demolish. Was that just venting? Olivia stumbled over her response, said she never meant those things. Jennifer's voice grew harder. Had Olivia researched property values? Met with architects about development plans? Discussed timeline strategies with her parents? Olivia denied everything, said she was not involved in business decisions. Jennifer produced emails, messages from Olivia to her father discussing Margaret specifically, asking about legal strategies, suggesting ways to pressure Ryan. Did Olivia write those emails? Olivia stared at the screen where her own words glowed accusingly. She tried to explain, to contextualize, but the words were clear, damning, undeniable. Jennifer pressed harder. Why was the wedding timeline so rushed? Olivia said they were in love, wanted to start their life together. Did it have anything to do with development timelines? With investor deadlines? With the need to secure Margaret's property within 6 months? Olivia's composure cracked. She said she did not know about those things. Jennifer produced more documents, development plans with Olivia's signature, financial projections Olivia had reviewed, timeline memos Olivia had contributed to. Was Olivia not involved? The courtroom was dead silent, everyone watching Olivia unravel. Finally, Jennifer asked the critical question. What was Olivia's true intention regarding Margaret's property? Olivia's face crumpled. Tears streamed. She tried to speak, but choked. Jennifer waited, patient, relentless. Olivia finally whispered that they needed the land, that the development depended on it, that they intended to acquire it by whatever means necessary. Gasps erupted in the courtroom. Several jurors sat back, expressions shocked. Jennifer let the admission hang in the air. Then she asked one more question. Did Olivia feel any remorse for what she had planned to do to an elderly woman who had done nothing wrong? Olivia wept, but said nothing. Her silence was answer enough. Judge Hendricks's voice cut through the tension. She rebuked Olivia sharply, said the court had heard enough, that the defendant's testimony had been devastating to her own case. She dismissed Olivia from the stand. Olivia stumbled back to the defense table. Marcus looked furious. His gamble had backfired catastrophically. The trial concluded shortly after. Closing arguments were brief. The evidence spoke for itself. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, their faces were grim. Guilty on all counts. Charles, Vivian, Olivia. All convicted of conspiracy, fraud, elder exploitation, and racketeering. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for exits. Victims wept with relief. The Carters sat motionless, destroyed. Margaret felt tears stream down her face, not tears of joy, just release. The weight she had carried for months finally lifting. Justice had been served. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks after the verdict. Judge Hendricks entered carrying a thick folder. The Carters sat at the defense table as convicted criminals awaiting punishment. Charles looked defeated. Vivian stared straight ahead, her hands trembling. Olivia wept quietly. Judge Hendricks addressed the severity of the crimes. Systematic fraud, targeting vulnerable people, elder exploitation. She said the court had reviewed 17 victim impact statements, 17 families whose lives had been destroyed. Her voice grew harder. White-collar crime was often treated too leniently, but theft was theft. Fraud was fraud. She looked at Charles. His role as architect made him most culpable. The sentence was 18 years in federal prison. No parole for 12 years. All assets seized. Charles's face went white. He was 68. His life was effectively over. Vivian received 12 years. Asset seizure. Victim restitution. Her mask cracked. She made a small sound like a wounded animal. Olivia received 14 years. Despite being younger, she had made choices, had actively participated, had mocked an innocent woman. Olivia collapsed, sobbing. 14 years. Her future was ashes. The judge ordered immediate seizure of all Carter properties. Everything would be sold. Carter Development Group would cease to exist. The company would be dismantled completely. Officers escorted the Carters away. Charles walked with forced dignity. Vivian moved like a sleepwalker. Olivia had to be supported by guards. They disappeared through a side door. Gone. Headed to federal prison. The courtroom slowly emptied. Victims hugged each other. Some cried with relief. Justice had been served, but it could not undo the damage. Margaret sat quietly. She felt no triumph, just quiet closure. The threat was gone. She was safe. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Margaret made a brief statement. She thanked the prosecutors, thanked the victims for their courage, thanked her children. She said she hoped this case would serve as a warning, that wealth did not place anyone above the law, that exploiting vulnerable people carried serious consequences. She walked to Emily's car with her children. They drove to Desert Bloom Studio. Home. The property looked exactly as it always had. The sign, the workshop, the kiln, the small adobe house. Nothing had changed physically, but everything felt different. Margaret stood in her yard. This place had nearly been stolen, had nearly become a luxury resort, but it had survived. She had survived. Over the following weeks, victim compensation began. Carter assets were liquidated, properties sold at auction, bank accounts emptied. Margaret received full compensation. She donated a portion to legal aid organizations, to groups that helped elderly people protect their property rights. She also expanded Desert Bloom Studio, added a teaching workshop, started offering pottery classes specifically for seniors, free for those who could not afford to pay. The classes filled immediately. Elderly people came from across the region, all found community and purpose. Margaret discovered she loved teaching, loved sharing her knowledge, loved watching uncertain hands gradually master the clay. Ryan returned to his environmental work, but the experience changed him. He became more active in advocating for protections against predatory development. He used his story to illustrate the need for stronger regulations. Emily stayed in touch constantly. She visited monthly. The experience inspired her own work with vulnerable families. She became fiercer, more determined. The Carter case made national news. It became a symbol of accountability, of ordinary people standing up to wealthy predators. Some criticized Ryan's methods, said the public humiliation was excessive, but far more people praised his courage. Margaret gave occasional interviews. She spoke calmly about her experience, about the importance of vigilance, about refusing to be intimidated by wealth or power. She became an unexpected advocate, an elderly potter who nearly became a victim, but instead became a symbol of resistance. 6 months after the sentencing, Margaret stood on her porch at sunset. The desert stretched endlessly. The sky blazed orange and purple. She thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the betrayal, the trial, the victory. She thought about the Carters in prison cells. She felt no satisfaction in their suffering, just quiet acceptance that consequences had been faced. She thought about the 17 other victims. At least they had received some compensation, some acknowledgement, some justice. Margaret whispered to the desert wind, not revenge, restoration. That was what this had been about, not punishing the guilty, though that happened indeed. But restoring balance, protecting the vulnerable, proving that ordinary people mattered. Ryan appeared beside her. He put his arm around her shoulders. They stood together watching the sunset. Margaret leaned against her son, the son who had protected her, who had gathered evidence for months, who had sacrificed his own happiness to keep her safe. She told him she was proud, so incredibly proud. Ryan's eyes filled with tears. He said he would do it again, would do anything to protect her. The sun dipped below the horizon. Stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Margaret and Ryan went inside. Emily was cooking dinner. The smell filled the small house. They gathered around the kitchen table. They ate and talked and laughed. They were family. They had survived. And they would continue building lives worth living. Outside, the desert night settled in, peaceful, vast, eternal. Desert Bloom Studio remained standing, a testament to hard work, to honesty, to the power of love and protection. Margaret Hayes, 67 years old, potter and survivor, had won her battle, not through wealth or power, but through truth, through courage, through a son who refused to let evil triumph. The storm had passed. The damage was repaired. The future stretched ahead, bright and safe. Justice had been served, restoration achieved. And in the quiet desert night, peace finally settled over them all.